Harold Pierce arrived at the job fair with a canvas duffel bag that looked more traveled than intended. It carried the things he actually needed: a folded copy of his resume with clean corners, a laminated card listing his contact information, and a small notebook whose pages were marked with careful handwriting. The duffel didn't announce anything heroic. It was simply the bag of a man who had learned to keep his essentials together. Outside the community center, the sky held the mild gray of early fall. Harold paused on the sidewalk as if the air itself required a moment's permission. He had learned over the years that rushing was something other people did. He didn't have the luxury of matching their pace. When he entered, the room was already awake with noise. Folding tables had been lined in rows like a temporary market. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, and the carpet absorbed footsteps in a way that made everything feel hushed underneath the talking. Posters on the walls showed smiling faces and corporate logos. Somewhere near the far end, a printer wheezed as though it was working too hard. Harold moved slowly enough to be overlooked. He wore a dark work jacket that wasn't new but was clean. His shirt collar sat flat. His shoes were scuffed at the toes but not ruined. His posture was straight in a way that came from habit rather than pride. Around him, people looked young in the way that meant they still believed the world would explain itself. Most were in their 20s or 30s, carrying bright folders, wearing fresh lanyards, and talking in quick bursts. Their faces showed that mix of hope and nerves that came from believing a single event could change everything. Harold accepted that he would be treated as a background detail. He found the table marked with a sign that read, "Local Hiring Team, Maribel Santos." The banner was laminated and slightly curled at the edge. Behind the table, a woman arranged pamphlets in neat stacks and looked up when Harold approached. Her smile landed politely, the kind that was automatic and meant to keep things moving. Harold set his notebook on the table's corner for a moment, then drew it back again as if he felt he might be intruding. He didn't push. He didn't try to bargain for attention. "Good morning," he said. Maribel Santos took in his face and then his bag, her expression following the common rhythm of scanning: age, appearance, perceived suitability. Then the smile remained, but it thinned just a little. People didn't mean to show that kind of calculation, but it happened anyway. "Hi," Maribel said. "We have a lot of employers here. What kind of work are you looking for?" Harold's voice stayed steady. "Maintenance. I've done facility support and equipment care. I'm not asking for a fantasy job, I just want something steady." Maribel nodded, already reaching for a form. "Sure. Can you tell me what you've done most recently?" Harold opened his notebook to a page where he had copied job dates and responsibilities in tidy lists. He spoke in plain sentences, not to impress, but to be accurate. When he mentioned his most recent stint maintaining a small municipal building, doing lock checks, HVAC filter changes, minor repairs, coordinating with electricians when something needed a real license, Maribel's eyes flicked down, then up again. "That's great," she said, and the tone was still kind, but it had the careful distance of someone hearing that the candidate's experience might be overqualified or might not fit the employer's preference. "How old are you, Harold?" Harold paused, not in confusion but in decision. He had learned that some questions were traps dressed as curiosity. 74, he answered. Maribel's smile tightened around the edges. "Okay, we'll see what's available. Most of our employers here are looking for shift flexibility, and some positions have physical requirements." Harold nodded once. "I understand." Maribel continued typing in a slow, practiced rhythm. "We can add you to our database, but I'm going to be honest. Some employers might assume you're just trying to fill time. You know how it goes." Harold watched her hands as she typed. He didn't argue. He had lived long enough to know that being correct didn't always persuade anyone. He slid his resume across the table. The paper looked old but legible. Maribel picked it up and glanced at the name, then at the employment section. She read the years slowly, and her face gave nothing away. Then behind Maribel, another staffer approached the table. His badge read, "Dwayne Carter." He leaned slightly toward the conversation, not quite taking part, but close enough to influence it. Dwayne Carter's expression was friendly at first, the kind of friendliness that existed on job fair floors. He looked at Harold's resume, then gave a brief glance at Harold's duffel. "Hey," Dwayne said, "we get a lot of folks who've done a lot of different things, but we're focused on people who are actively seeking work right now in the normal timeline." Harold's gaze stayed on Dwayne without challenge. He had no reason to fight. He had come to find an opening. Maribel looked up. "Dwayne, Dwayne interrupted gently, like someone trying to help manage. "Maribel, it's fine. I'm just saying, Harold here," he pronounced the name as if it came from a list. "He might be retired. It's a job fair, not a benefits fair." Maribel's eyebrows lifted. "We didn't say—" Dwayne shrugged. "I'm not trying to be rude. I'm just thinking about the time. Employers have limited spots. If someone is 74 and not going to be able to do the job requirements—" Harold let that sentence sit between them. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A printer somewhere continued working, pushing out more paper. People walked past their table, glancing quickly and then moving on. Maribel Santos looked at Harold's face again. This time her politeness returned more visibly, but it carried a different weight now. "Harold," Maribel said carefully, "do you have any recent employment references? Someone we can contact, not just dates." Harold answered with the references he had. He named people whose names were real and whom he had actually worked alongside. His voice stayed controlled, even when he saw Maribel's attention drift toward the next person waiting in line. Maribel checked her notes. "These references are older," she said. "Are you able to provide something more current?" Harold considered how to respond without making it into a defense. He had learned that people preferred explanations that didn't demand too much empathy from them. "I have current contacts," he said, and reached into his duffel. He didn't pull out a dramatic stack of documents. He pulled out one folder with a single sheet clipped inside. He offered it across the table. Maribel glanced at it. The sheet included the name of a coordinator for a short-term contract he had completed, someone who handled maintenance scheduling for a nonprofit facility. It wasn't corporate. It wasn't flashy. It was real. Dwayne Carter leaned in. His mouth formed a small, skeptical line. "This is a contract?" "Yes," Harold said. "And you're looking for full-time now?" Dwayne asked. Harold nodded. "If it's a good fit." Dwayne's eyes traveled over Harold's hands, the knuckles, the scars. "Look, I'm just going to say what everyone's thinking. Most employers aren't going to want a man who's been out of the mainstream workforce for a while. They don't want to spend time figuring out if you can keep up." Maribel Santos made a small sound, like she wanted to correct him but didn't know how. Her hands kept moving on her keyboard, clicking and tapping as if speed could cover discomfort. Harold didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for anger. Instead, he said, "I can keep up. I'm here because I'm ready to work." The sentence seemed to land quietly. It didn't demand permission. Dwayne gave a short laugh that was supposed to be harmless. "Sure, we'll see. Thanks for stopping by." Maribel Santos added, "I'll keep your resume in the pile, but I can't promise anything. You should also apply directly online to the companies." Harold gathered his folder and notebook again. He stood up, and the motion was careful but controlled. He didn't look defeated, he looked patient. As he stepped away, he heard Dwayne Carter speak low enough that Harold had to be near to catch it. "Some of these older guys," Dwayne murmured, "they think the world owes them a chance." Maribel Santos didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "We just need to be honest." Harold walked to a bench nearby. He sat with his duffel at his feet and watched the room like a man watching weather. People were always moving. He didn't need to change direction, he just needed to be available when something mattered. A few tables down, a recruiter was interviewing someone who looked like they were fresh out of training. A young man repeated his resume highlights with energy that made Harold's chest ache. Not with sadness, but with the memory of trying to believe in something simple. Harold allowed himself a quiet breath. He didn't resent the young. He had been young once. He remembered how it felt to want proof. Then, about 15 minutes into the job fair, the room changed. It wasn't dramatic at first. It was a subtle shift. Voices turning toward a corner, a rising pitch in conversation, people stepping back as if they had bumped into something invisible. Harold saw Maribel Santos turn her head toward the back of the room. She stood halfway from her chair before she seemed to remember her role as staff. Dwayne Carter moved away from his table, leaving it unattended. He pushed through the crowd, then stopped. Harold stood too. At first he couldn't tell what was happening because bodies blocked the view. But he noticed a woman, someone wearing a bright scarf and a visitor badge, holding her chest with one hand and gesturing wildly with the other. Her face had gone pale. Her eyes were wide in a way that wasn't just fear. It was the look of a person trying to pull air into a body that wasn't cooperating. Someone said, "Does anyone have training?" Another voice answered, "Call 911!" The sound of the dispatcher on a phone reached the ears of everyone within earshot. It was not the calm sound of someone who expected to handle this. It was the frantic sound of a person trying to do it right. Maribel Santos stood near the edge of the circle, her hands uncertain. She looked at the woman on the floor and then looked around at the crowd, as if searching for authority in the air. Dwayne Carter stood near her shoulder. His face had shifted into seriousness, but his posture was still that of someone who hadn't expected to take over. She can't," a man started, then stopped because words failed. Harold pushed through the outer ring of onlookers slowly. People made space for him the way they made space for someone who looked like they might not be trouble. They assumed he was just another older person. He knelt beside the woman, careful not to crowd her, careful not to make her movement feel like a punishment. Her eyes darted to him. She tried to speak and couldn't. Her lips moved, but only air came out. Harold noticed the details quickly. The woman's breathing was shallow and irregular. Her hands were cold. Her fingers had a faint gray tinge near the nails. Someone had already called 911, and the phone on speaker had told the dispatcher their address. Harold didn't need melodrama. He needed action. He leaned close enough for the woman to feel he was present, then spoke in a steady voice. "Hey, I'm here. I'm going to help you breathe and keep you safe until help arrives." The woman's eyes flickered at him, tracking his face as if searching for whether he meant it. Harold placed one hand gently on her shoulder, not to restrain, but to ground her. With the other hand, he checked her airway position and her chest movement. Someone behind him asked, "Do you know what to do?" The question came out in a tone that sounded like the question itself was a way of buying time. People wanted permission to act. Harold didn't announce training. He didn't say he was a veteran because he didn't want his identity to become part of the show. He just responded plainly. "I'm going to make sure she can keep an open airway," he said. A young man offered a blanket. Another offered water. Harold declined both, moving with calm efficiency. Maribel Santos stood at a slight distance, watching as if she hadn't expected anything useful from an older man. Her mouth was slightly open. Dwayne Carter's jaw clenched. In the background, people kept talking in quick, overlapping sentences. Someone mentioned heart problems. Someone mentioned panic. Someone else said she might be allergic. Harold listened, but he kept doing what mattered. He checked her responsiveness. Her eyes moved but didn't fix. Her breathing remained unstable. Then he reached for something he had brought into his duffel almost by habit, a small first aid kit he kept for his own needs and occasionally for other people. It was not an impressive kit. It was practical. He pulled out a small pair of gloves and put them on. Maribel Santos took a half step forward, her expression shifting from uncertainty to focus. She saw the gloves and the careful movement, and the shift in her face happened in fractions of a second. Harold's voice stayed even. "Do you know if she has an inhaler? Asthma? Anything like that?" A man rummaged in the woman's small purse, pulling out a folded card and then a medication bottle. Harold didn't grab at it. He asked, "Is this for her?" The man nodded, then handed it over. Harold read the label quickly. He didn't treat it as a solution. He treated it as a clue. He held her chin gently, checking her airway. He kept her on her side in a position that protected her from aspirating if she vomited. It looked simple, but it was exactly the kind of simple that prevented worse outcomes. The dispatcher's voice on speaker said, "We have units on the way. Are you able to do CPR if needed?" Harold nodded, though nobody could see him nod from the back of the crowd. He didn't speak to the dispatcher directly. He spoke to the people around him. "If she stops responding or breathing normally, someone will need to start chest compressions," he said. "We'll watch for changes. I want one person to be ready." Maribel Santos's eyes widened. She looked at Dwayne Carter. Dwayne's hands lifted slightly as if he might volunteer. Then he realized too late that his earlier tone had already decided his credibility in the room. He forced his body to move anyway. "I can," Dwayne said. His voice wasn't confident, but it was earnest. Harold nodded once. "Good. Stay here." He didn't give Dwayne a lecture. He didn't make him earn it with words. He gave him a job. Seconds passed. People waited for the moment to become dramatic, the way crowds always did. But Harold didn't let it become spectacle. He adjusted the woman's head position with careful, small movements. He monitored her chest. He watched her skin color. Then, just as the woman's eyes fluttered and her body tightened, her breathing changed. It wasn't suddenly perfect. It was steadier. It was the kind of steadiness you could feel in a room when everyone realized the worst had been delayed. A woman near the back whispered, "Oh my God, she's breathing." Harold kept his hands in place long enough to ensure she didn't slip back into worse breathing. He didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He acted like the work was still incomplete. Maribel Santos was crying quietly now, her shoulders rising and falling as she tried not to make a scene. Her tears didn't look rehearsed. They looked like they were arriving because her mind had finally caught up to reality. Dwayne Carter looked down at Harold's hands. They were steady. There were faint tremors in age and strain, but the movements were controlled. His left wrist scar was visible when he adjusted the woman's position. Harold checked the clock on his phone without letting his focus break. Then he remembered the time didn't matter as much as continuity. When the ambulance finally arrived, paramedics cut through the crowd with practiced urgency. The responders asked questions quickly. What happened? How long? Any allergies? Any medication administered? Harold answered without embellishment. The paramedic paused and studied Harold for a moment. Then she looked at the woman's airway position and the way Harold had positioned her. "You did this right," the paramedic said, her voice calm but certain. Harold nodded. "She was unstable. She needed protection." The paramedic said, "You should come with us if you're family." Harold shook his head. "I'm not. I'm just here." Maribel Santos stepped closer then, as if approaching a stranger who had become essential. She wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. "Harold," she said, using his name with a different tone than earlier, the tone of a person who had misjudged and couldn't erase it. "Thank you." Harold looked at her carefully. "Are you okay?" Maribel swallowed. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't—" Dwayne Carter tried to speak, but his voice caught. He cleared his throat and managed, "I thought he was—" Then he stopped, because the thought sounded worse the moment he tried to say it out loud. Harold didn't ask for apologies. He understood that apologies could become selfish, a way for someone to feel less guilty. He wasn't there to manage Dwayne's feelings. Instead, Harold turned toward the paramedics and helped them transition the woman onto a stretcher safely. He remained one step back, allowing professionals to do their work while providing information. The paramedic in charge looked at Harold again. "Do you have any medical training?" Harold considered the question. He could have answered with a certification number. He could have offered the dramatic version of his past, rank and medals and deployments. But he didn't. Not because he was hiding anything, because he knew some truths should be used only when they served someone. "I've kept myself ready," he said. When the ambulance doors finally closed, the room exhaled. People gathered their belongings too late, as if they had been waiting for permission to go back to being casual. Harold walked away from the center of attention. Maribel Santos followed him a few steps. "Why didn't you say anything?" Maribel asked. Her voice was quieter now, stripped of the job fair polish. Harold stopped near a wall where the posters were still bright. He looked at his hands for a moment, as if confirming that they still belonged to him. I don't talk about it, he said. People get ideas, and then they stop seeing what's in front of them. Maribel's eyes searched his face. Earlier, Dwayne. Harold held up a hand, not to silence her, but to ask her to continue in a way that stayed grounded. I know what he said, he replied. Maribel flinched. I didn't agree, I thought. Harold turned his gaze toward the open room. The job fair continued in a way that felt wrong, but it continued anyway because life did that. People still wanted jobs. Companies still needed workers. He said, It's fine. You weren't trying to hurt me. Maribel shook her head slowly. I was. Not on purpose, but I was. Harold nodded once. That's how it starts for everyone. Dwayne Carter stood a few feet away, hovering. He looked like a man who had learned something without wanting to. His earlier posture of authority had collapsed into something more human. Maribel turned toward him. Dwayne, you need to... Dwayne swallowed. He walked over to Harold and stood with his hands at his sides, no longer pretending to be casual. Harold, he said, voice rough. I said things earlier. I didn't know what you could do. Harold watched him. Now you do. Dwayne's eyes were wet. He looked away quickly, embarrassed by his own emotion. She asked for CPR readiness. I didn't know what to do. And you just knew.
Like it was normal.
Harold's face remained calm. It becomes normal when you've seen the consequences. Dwayne nodded, as if those words explained everything and also condemned him. Maribel Santos asked, But who are you? I've seen a lot of resumes. Your background didn't match what people expected from your age, so... Harold's breath moved slow. He had practiced restraint for years. He wasn't tired of truth. He was tired of how people turned truth into performance. But this moment had already changed the room. Something had been exposed. Maribel reached into her bag and pulled out Harold's resume, the one she had kept in a pile. Her fingers tightened around it. She looked down at the name at the top again. Harold Pierce. Then her eyes flicked to the employment history and stopped at a section she hadn't read closely earlier. She scanned the lines with a new kind of attention, the kind that made the fluorescent hum sound sharper. Her mouth parted. Dwayne Carter saw Maribel's reaction and leaned closer. He read what she read, and his face changed. Not dramatically, just the way a person changes when they realize the ground under them had been hiding weight. Harold waited. Maribel's voice was barely audible. This says, enlisted in 1970, facility engineering instructor, deployment-related incident response. Dwayne's eyes narrowed as he followed the lines. There's a list of certifications here, too. Advanced first response, emergency communication systems, and... Maribel lifted a page printed with an official-looking seal. She swallowed. On the page were unit identifiers and service history. There were abbreviations, dates, and a set of accomplishments written in a way that didn't sound like marketing. The job fair people weren't experts in reading military documentation, but they were not stupid either. Some labels were self-explanatory even without knowing the details. Then Maribel turned the resume around and held it up for Dwayne and for herself, as if needing confirmation that the paper was real. Across the room, a man from a nearby employer table noticed movement and the sudden quiet. He walked closer and read over Maribel's shoulder. Another person stepped in, then another. The job fair floor grew tense, not with fear, but with the discomfort of being wrong in public. Maribel didn't say veteran, like it was a label meant to excuse someone. She read in a steadier voice, as though reciting facts to keep herself from shaking. Harold could hear her words carry. He didn't like attention. Still, he didn't move away. Dwayne Carter's eyes stayed fixed on the resume's service portion. His face had gone pale in a way that didn't match his earlier skepticism. He whispered, Harold, your unit. Maribel's breath caught. It lists a call sign. Dwayne looked up, searching Harold's face like he was trying to make it match the paper. Harold kept his posture steady. I don't use it anymore, he said. Maribel's voice softened. You don't have to. She lowered the resume slightly and then looked at the burn scar on his left wrist. That scar suddenly made sense in a way it hadn't before. People could speculate endlessly about scars, but the details inside the resume made the scar a story rather than a mystery. A few people in the crowd leaned closer to read, and that lean became a kind of reverence. Nobody wanted to be rude. Nobody wanted to make another mistake. A supervisor from one of the employers approached. She had a clipboard and a stern expression until she saw the documents. "What is this?" the supervisor asked. Maribel answered, voice careful. "He helped a visitor at the fair. He stabilized her airway and repositioned her before paramedics arrived." The supervisor's gaze settled on Harold's face. She looked at the scar again, then at his calm hands. Then she nodded once, slowly. "It's in your file," the supervisor said, reading a line. "It says you were the incident response coordinator for—" She paused because saying the full details out loud sounded like it belonged in a courtroom, not in a job fair. Harold didn't correct her. He didn't confirm each line for the entertainment of strangers. But the room had reached the point where it couldn't stay shallow anymore. Somebody in the crowd asked quietly, "Are you one of those?" The person meant, "Are you one of the people we hear about in training manuals and news stories? People whose names are not spoken lightly?" Maribel didn't answer for him. Harold didn't give a performance of humility. He simply answered with truth that didn't stretch. "I served," Harold said. "I learned to keep calm and do what keeps people alive." The words were plain. Still, they landed like a door closing. Because the earlier dismissals had been about age, about perceived usefulness, about the assumption that time erased competence. Now the truth arrived without drama, and it silenced people the way real facts do. Dwayne Carter looked at Harold's face with a kind of regret that didn't know what to do with itself. He tried one more sentence, and it came out like a confession. "I judged you," he said. "I assumed I don't know how to fix that." Harold's eyes stayed on him. "You can start by not assuming next time." Dwayne nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, I can." Maribel Santos stepped between Harold and the growing crowd just slightly, not to block attention, but to keep the focus on dignity rather than spectacle. "Harold," she said, "I want to apologize properly, not as a formality. You didn't just save someone today." She looked around at the gathered people, and the quiet in the room deepened. "You made us see the difference between a resume and a person." Harold didn't smile widely. His face moved with a small, restrained expression that could have been gratitude or could have been exhaustion. The line between them was thin. "I'm not asking for praise," he said. Maribel shook her head. "Then I won't praise. I'll just tell you the truth." She leaned forward slightly. "You're qualified," she said. "You're more qualified than most people here believe exists in this building." A few employers began speaking to Maribel and to one another. Jobs that had seemed out of reach started looking possible. People started asking practical questions. What shift flexibility he could offer, whether he could handle maintenance planning, whether he could train interns. Maribel answered carefully, keeping Harold's boundaries intact. Harold didn't oversell himself. He didn't turn the moment into a negotiation built on emotion. When one employer asked, "Would you be willing to mentor younger staff?" Harold considered and then answered with honesty. "Yes," he said, "if the mentoring is real work, not just empty talk." The employer nodded. "We can do that." Then another employer asked, "Do you have any restrictions? Health limitations?" Harold gave a straightforward answer. What he could do comfortably, what he needed help with, what he refused to risk. He wasn't trying to convince anyone he was superhuman. He was trying to be reliable. Maribel Santos looked at him like she was seeing the world accurately for the first time. "Why didn't you tell us who you were?" she asked again, but now it sounded less like an accusation and more like curiosity. Harold's gaze moved to the job fair crowd. He watched how some people avoided eye contact, how some people tried to nod as if they could apologize without speaking. He watched how the earlier mockery had turned into careful silence. He said, "Because I wanted to be judged by what I do when it matters. I didn't want anyone to clap because my past was interesting." Maribel's eyes glistened. But your past it's not just interesting, it's not for them, Harold said gently. It's for the people who need it. Maribel held the gaze for a moment, then nodded. Dwayne Carter stepped forward and extended a hand. Harold, he said, I'm going to help you get connected to the right employer. Not because you proved something today, because you already were. Harold shook his hand firmly. Dwayne's grip tightened and then loosened in relief at being able to do something useful. Maribel Santos pulled out her phone and started typing. I'm putting you down for an interview, immediately. Harold objected at first with a small motion. Don't rush it, he said. I don't need a headline. I need a schedule. Maribel nodded. Fine, a schedule. The room began to return to its usual noise level, but it returned with a different texture. People spoke more carefully. They didn't laugh at resumes. They didn't treat experience like a relic. A man who had been making jokes earlier cleared his throat and then quietly gathered his papers. He didn't look toward Harold. He looked down as if his own shame required privacy. Harold sat back on the bench and let his hands rest. The adrenaline of the rescue had faded, leaving behind a quiet awareness of time. He heard the ambulance crew speak to someone at the entrance. He guessed they were updating the dispatcher and family members. A little later, a phone call came in to Maribel Santos's work number. Her face tightened as she listened. Then she said, Yes, that's him. Yes, he's here. She hung up and looked at Harold. How is she? Harold asked. Maribel exhaled. They stabilized her. She's responsive. She's awake. The paramedics said... She paused and looked at Harold like she wanted to honor the truth without exaggeration. They said you did exactly what you should have done. Nothing extra, just the right thing. Harold nodded. That's all anyone can do. Maribel's eyes softened. But it changed the room. Harold looked around again and saw people already shifting their attention. Employers who had been browsing resumes now asked if Harold had a preference for a position. Young candidates who had walked past him now hovered with cautious respect. Some of them looked embarrassed. Some looked inspired. Some looked like they were trying to understand how their assumptions had failed them. Harold didn't try to correct them with speeches. He waited. A teenage volunteer asked, Sir, were you in the military? Harold considered the question. The teenager's voice was sincere but nervous. Harold nodded once. I served. The teenager swallowed. Do you think... Can you teach us? Harold looked at the volunteer's face and saw the question underneath the question. Can we learn without becoming what hurt us? He answered carefully. If you want to learn, show up prepared, not to impress, to help. The teenager nodded quickly, absorbing the words like they were a lesson. Maribel Santos watched the exchange and felt something settle inside her. Not guilt anymore, something like responsibility. She turned back toward Harold. We're going to get you interviewed today, she said. One of the employers here has a facilities supervisor opening. They're also looking for someone who can train and coordinate. Harold listened, then asked, Which company? Maribel gave the name. Harold repeated it once. I know that name, he said, not because it was famous, but because he had learned patterns over time. Businesses that stayed afloat usually had consistent needs. Maribel smiled. So you're not pretending you know things? Harold's mouth moved slightly, almost like humor, but not quite. I don't pretend. Dwayne Carter returned with a folder and a clipboard. He looked like a man who had decided to rebuild his own sense of integrity from scratch. I set up an interview slot for you with HR, Dwayne said. They said if you can do the work, they'll put you where you fit. No games. Harold nodded. Good. As the crowd gradually dispersed, Harold stood up carefully and adjusted his duffel strap. His shoulders remained steady. He didn't act like he had just become a hero. He acted like a man leaving a job site. Maribel Santos walked with him toward the exit. She didn't crowd him. She stayed a step beside him. Outside, the air had cooled a little. Leaves skittered across the sidewalk. The same gray sky hung overhead, indifferent to people's redemption stories. Maribel stopped near the entrance and looked at Harold. "Do you ever get tired of being misunderstood?" Harold considered. "Yes," he said, "but tired isn't new. It's just part of being alive." Maribel's gaze dropped to his scar again. "Then why keep going?" Harold's answer came slowly, as if he were choosing words that would not offend anyone who heard them. "Because people still need someone who doesn't stop," he said. "And because I don't like leaving things undone. Not in my life." Maribel's eyes filled. She didn't wipe the tears this time. She let them be visible because honesty required it. She held out her hand again. "Thank you," she said. Harold shook it and held the handshake an extra moment, not to claim anything, but to acknowledge the human connection. Behind them, the job fair continued. Another recruiter called out a question. Another applicant held a resume with shaky hands. Harold walked away with his duffel bag and his calm. His next step was practical, not cinematic. But something remained behind in that room, a silence that hadn't been forced. It had been earned by truth. When people later tried to retell the story, they would get it wrong in the way people always did. They would focus on the dramatic moment. They would forget the restraint that held everything together. They would overlook the quiet way Harold had refused to make the moment about himself. They would remember only that he had saved a life. And they would learn for once not to confuse appearance with capability. Harold didn't need their admiration. He needed the next opportunity to do the work that mattered. And as the doors closed behind him, his dignity stayed intact, unshaken by judgment, confirmed by action.